I'm very glad to be here today at the China Exchange. I should confess, first of all, it is my first time to come to Chinatown, not for Chinese food. Speaking of which, I'm a little bit hungry now. But for more serious business like academic and public events like this Hong Kong. I'm very glad also to see some of my students here today from my Chinese politics course. Each time when I start the course in September, the first week, we're going to talking about China under Qing Dynasty. And none of my British students nor European students know anything about Opium War or Argo-China War. One student this year even went to Old Summer Palace, but she never heard of Yuan Mingyuan, let alone how Yuan Mingyuan was burned in the end. I'm not surprised. I mean, this happens every year. I guess probably it's fair to say the Opium War is a small war for Great Britain or the conqueror of British Empire, but it is a very important one for China. You can pretty much say it's a starting point of Chinese modern history, and one of the key consequences of that will be Hong Kong, which is why we are here today. I remember back in 1997, I was still a teenager and sitting on the couch and watch about Hong Kong's handover ceremony with my parents. Basically, mainland China, there's a kind of emotional feeling about unification between mainland China and Hong Kong. Probably at the time, people in Hong Kong will feel it quite differently. I'm not sure about that. But 20 years later, we are here, 2017, talking about unification of Hong Kong and Found and Lost. I think this is a perfect title for Being Human Festival. So I guess I will let each speaker introduce yourself, maybe for 1 minute or two, and then we can start talking about what are the implications of the unification for Hong Kong socially, economically, and politically. Dr. Yin, do you want to start by introduce yourself?
Good point. Thank you very much. Thank you for sorting that out for me. First of all, appreciate to be here. First time to be in an academic event in Chinatown. Had I known this is in Chinatown, I would be more enthusiastic. Coming earlier, a good Baozi meal. But I myself is a historian by training. I work on 19th and 20th century intellectual history with a focus on Europe, Eurasia continent. And I do intellectual history, a bit of legal history, looking at the translation of international law. And right now, I'm in a project of looking at the 20th century third world nations with a particular focus on the issue of internationalism. How do people see the world at that time? And how did that particular perception of the world impact their own way of interacting with the rest of the world as well as their neighbors? So yeah, this being human is part of, it's actually falls very nicely in the current research interest that I'm, theoretically, I'm interested in. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Dr. Winnie King. Sorry, my name is Winnie King. I'm at the University of Bristol. I specialize in international political economy and international relations, in particular looking at Taiwan-China relations. What I do is I look at how Chinese economic development has influenced its relationship with Taiwan. And my current research is looking at how its economic development and structural reforms and currency internationalization is really engaging more with Britain. So my current research is looking, in particular, looking at how the Cameron-Osborne efforts to engage with China with regards to investment and currency trade and currency, creating a currency hub in the city would benefit Britain.
Hello everybody, my name's Astrid Nordin. I'm not at all an expert on Hong Kong really, but my first encounter with China was through Hong Kong when I moved there to be an undergraduate student in Hong Kong in 2006. And it was so influential on me that I rejigged my career and became a China expert, as it were. And now I'm a senior lecturer at Lancaster University, where I specialise on understandings of China's role in the world and how China relates to different parts of the world, both inward and outward. And I am a very new Brit. I've been British for about 2 weeks. And so I'm finding myself making a lot of jokes about having to find new ways of relating to proper empire. Sweden was not doing so. You know, we had Norway and Finland, and that was it. So I'm finding this discussion really interesting for me to relate in a new way, and I think Jinghan is very correct. I also moved to Hong Kong without really knowing anything about the history of empire there. So I am one of those students who has been reawakened and reunited with this history, and I think a lot of you will also be able to share a lot of your thoughts on that with us, which I look very much forward to.
My name is Nick Orr. I grew up in Hong Kong. I spent most of my time in Hong Kong, education, secondary school, university, up until my master's study. And I come to the UK to study my PhD, and I'm a final year PhD student in politics. My thesis is about Hong Kong's legislative politics and party politics. Although relatively new in my research career, I still have a large bunch of research on other areas such as media in Hong Kong, as well as the electoral politics, etc., etc. Yeah.
Great. I think we have a panel of speakers who specialize in different parts of China and Hong Kong as well. So, Winnie, why don't you kick off the ball by talking a little bit more about what kind of economic impact does this unification between mainland China and Hong Kong have?
Okay, happy to. Thank you very much. I think what I'm going to say might be a bit controversial. The main thing that we need to think about over the last 20 years is it's been a bit of a double-edged sword. I'm sure when we talk about the social and political side, this will come out much more. When unification happened in 1997, a big concern was the fact that as China's economy was developing, what would the rise of Shanghai, as we saw even in the video, mean for Hong Kong? Because China is trying to establish Shanghai as a major financial center. Hong Kong's economy is not particularly diverse. It's 93.8% services, very much finance, insurance oriented. 7% industry and 0.1% agriculture. So it's very much, if Shanghai rises, what you do is you see a real contentious kind of situation for Hong Kong. As the years go on and we see the relationship between Hong Kong and China becoming closer, China becomes Hong Kong's #1 trading partner. 50% of Hong Kong's trade is with China. So it becomes a question of to what extent is Hong Kong becoming overly dependent and losing its identity and really becoming too strongly linked to not just China's economy, but China as a whole. But if we want to look at the more positive side, as China develops, there's a lot of potential success and opportunity for China, for Hong Kong, that Hong Kong wouldn't have had with regards to unification. A perfect example would be the fact that because China is really pushing its efforts to promote its own development through infrastructure, Hong Kong is the recipient of this. There's an $11 billion high-speed rail being built between the mainland and China. There's seaway, there's tunnel linking between Hong Kong, Macau, and the mainland. And so all of these things have potential benefits for Hong Kong and its economy, as well as its continued development. Hong Kong has very much been placed and seen as the jewel in China's economic crown because of its advantages with regards to a very strong rule of law, a very strong reputation internationally, not just in the area of services, but in the economy in general. So China's decision to place Hong Kong at the center of its finance and currency internationalization and development strategy to look beyond China's own borders places Hong Kong in quite an advantageous position. So I won't touch upon the future because that's the session that we have next, but that we have later. But I think that's one really good way to kind of view it. There are a lot of things that we could talk about with regards to potential risks and negative sides, but I think one thing to take away is that if it wasn't for China, Hong Kong would actually not necessarily be as strong as it is today.
Thanks very much, Winnie. Actually, I was in another meeting this morning, and we were talking about China-UK relations. And I think Dr. Li Zhong from Queen Mary University showed me about how much Chinese investment go to UK and how much UK investment go to China. And I was shocked about the role Hong Kong is actually playing in that kind of process. So even now, we have been talking about the rise of Shenzhen, the rise of Shanghai, and in mainland China, there's a lot of talk about competition between Shenzhen and Hong Kong, but Hong Kong still play a very important role in Chinese investment overseas and the foreign direct investment to China as well. So that's a very important part. I think we will leave a discussion about Hong Kong's future and especially economic future to the discussion later. Astrid, do you like to talk a little bit about Hong Kong's political impact part or probably the identity of Hong Kongese people after unification?
Thank you. So one of the big changes that we mustn't forget about, ironically, I think, about the transition from British rule to Chinese rule in Hong Kong is actually democratisation, that not being British allowed Hong Kong to become more democratic and have new institutions moving towards democracy. And of course, today we have an increasingly tense situation where the limits to that development are being drawn by the mainland government. So I think a key tension that has arisen as a perhaps slightly later than people expected consequence of this transition has been a change in identity within Hong Kong towards having at least a group of people who advocate separatism, who have a sense of Hong Kong identity as their primary national identity, which was just not there at the point of handover in the way that it is today. So I think this is a key change in terms of Hong Kong identity, that this local patriotism has emerged. On the Chinese side, I think the role of Hong Kong has been really significant to mainland Chinese identity, of course, as a symbol of the successful vindication in relation to the 100 years of national humiliation that is a constant trope in mainland China, and also the party state's ability to claim ownership of this success, of this standing up to foreign imperialist incursions in China. So Hong Kong has played a massively important role to the nation state's building, or the state identity building, also on the mainland Chinese side, or the PRC side.
I think that's relevant to Taiwan issue as well. I mean, each time when talking about Taiwan issue, there's also a key role of 100 years of humiliation and all this that in the Chinese identity, which make China, especially Beijing, unlikely to compromise on those kind of issues. They always have to make a balance between the realistic diplomacy and how to satisfy the domestic nationalists as well. Dr. Yin, do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about how do you think about the democratization movements in Hong Kong and what kind of political, social impact unification might have?
Sure. Unlike my wonderful colleagues, I'm not economist. I'm neither a political scientist. I'm just a good old humble student of history. So, from my area, my limited knowledge about Hong Kong is predominantly focusing on its political and social function in the course of the 19th and 20th century. So basically, my colleague from Bristol mentioned that Hong Kong is referred as a jewel on the crown of the Chinese economic development. But I remember in 1997, there is a song, or when I was in high school, there was a song with the returning of Hong Kong at the unification. The song got popular. The name of it is The Pearl of the Orient, the East, the Pearl of the East. So we remember in the 90s, Hong Kong, along with 3 other Asian cities, were considered as the triumph, the miracle in the neoliberal economic development, which were referred as the 4 little dragons: Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and Korea and Seoul. So all those 4 city-states, well, predominantly Singapore and Hong Kong city-states, actually play a quite vital role in the imperial colonial system. But nowadays, our focus is more importantly focusing either, on one hand, the imperial history of it by itself, or focusing on the contemporary issue of economic development. Hong Kong was seen as the jewel of the economic development. But however, to the period that I'm interested in, Hong Kong was also a Casablanca in the Orient. During the containment period, not going so far from the earlier 20th century, which we could, but starting from the Cold War time, when we know the mainland China was facing the political containment from the Truman Doctrine. So, but China was not completely cut off from the rest of the world, unlike today's perception. The main outlet for China's interaction for the outside world, of course, is the third world. But the main outlet for China to go to the third world is actually Hong Kong. So Hong Kong plays an intermediate between the so-called Red China as well as the outside world. So in that sense, China's significance to China, or particularly the PRC, the People's Republic of China, emerged in the political environment during the Cold War time, which is considered as the containment of China. Had this been gone, which, by the way, is the case of the 1990s, well, probably people could go even further. It's like Nixon's visit to China in 1972. But this period, once the containment policy was gone, the Hong Kong's political significance was kind of tuned down a little bit to the mainland China once everywhere else could interact with the outside world. So that probably starts the transition of the political relation between China and mainland China and Hong Kong. And also, during the time of containment, Hong Kong was legally a colony, so legally not related to China's activity. And at that time, the Chinese Communist Party continues to be a relatively grassroots party, i.e. being a revolutionary party. They're good at social mobilization, they're good at connecting with the grassroots people, they're good at delivering the message through social movements. But nowadays, with China, the Communist Party moving more and more upwards as a ruling party, it kind of lost touch with the Hong Kong grassroots. Whereas kind of a triggers, I guess this is an elephant in the room that everybody wants to address, is the Yellow Umbrella movement just a couple of years ago. But at least for the generation, for the parenting generation of those who are engaged in the Yellow Umbrella movement, was completely unimaginable. Whereas the issue only emerged in the post the financial crisis era. Maybe the answer towards the emergence of the Yellow Umbrella was not necessarily so much so about the political formula that everybody wants to impose or don't want to impose, but probably we could understand this very issue from a larger international background. The lost connection between the ruling party and the grassroots, the loss of a representativity, which fundamentally can be observed pretty much everywhere. And that's a warning shot, I guess, for everywhere. Had we witnessed or understand what does the grassroots think, we might not have a Brexit. Or had we had understanding of what does the redneck think, we might not have Donald Trump over the stage. So we might. I'm just throwing balls over here, right? So I guess that's just my observation as a historian.
Well, thanks very much for Dr. Ying. I think it's quite nice to have some historical, let's say, background discussion these issues. Obviously, I think umbrella and Occupy Central movement are now very, very important to Hong Kong politics. I know that some of their student leaders have been frequently invited to London to talk about this issue at different kind of places. So I think as a wider issue, this really generally reflects about socio-economic problems that Hong Kong is having so far. I was speaking to one of my friends this morning, and he is about to move to Hong Kong, and he showed me about the rent and the housing price in Hong Kong that was unbelievably high. It's like probably twice, 3 times more than London. Here, I will often every single day we complain about how expensive here housing price in London. So I think at the wider level, it's really reflection, as Occupy Central, also reflection about people's dissatisfaction with the Hong Kong government as well. But this also put a very serious, I think, governance challenge to the Hong Kong government, and also for Beijing to handling about this as well, given that Hong Kong has always been trying to be framed as the role model for one country, two system, which we will talk a little bit about Hong Kong's future or the future of one country, two system. I think it's quite nice you talk about Trump. I'm not sure which specific Hong Kong legislator can be referred to Trump. I'm not sure whether the Trump in Hong Kong has already appeared or not yet.
But it's just good fun to mention the name.
Yeah, but I totally agree. I think probably there is also a division between the grassroots in Hong Kong and maybe a little bit about the elites as well, given the how much of them benefit from globalization. We will come back to that later. But Nick, can you tell us a little bit more about what kind of changes have people seen in their everyday life after unification? What are your view on that?
Do you expect me to talk about the housing price in Hong Kong? And I've got a personal experience, right? No, I'm not going to talk about it. You can read it from the news, obviously. So about the everyday life, the social interaction. So, I mean, I think in Hong Kong it's still culturally really diverse, really energetic. Obviously, the political domain is not that happy in general. But people, I mean, still in general quite got a really good, really good at, had a really huge spending power, generally rich, except that we can't really afford the housing in Hong Kong. But I mean, the main impact about the unification, what I would say, is the closer interaction between mainland China and Hong Kong after the handover, right? Obviously, China becomes richer and richer after the handover, partly because it had a really good policy formulation in terms of economic policy, but also Hong Kong played an important role. But after China becomes richer and the interaction of Hong Kong people and mainland China become closer, I think Hong Kong people, not just, I mean, before 1997, we expect that China would, when China become rich, the government would become softer, and there's one main discourse in Hong Kong saying that when after the handover, we would expect the Chinese government would be more democratized, and when it become a democratic government one day, Hong Kong could have a real democracy. This discourse, I think, is no longer hold, and a lot of young people, they say that, I mean, the discourse I talk about is really popular in the 80s, that people in Hong Kong, they talk about unification. But now, after 2000, the younger generation saying that, hey, why the older people talk about such a disappointing expectation? And they should be more contentious in the 80s, but not be so, you shouldn't show that you are willing to collaborate with CCP because they shouldn't be trusted. So it's a really, really a bad time. So if we see a longer historical perspective after the handover in 20 years, I think Hong Kong used to be, I mean, China's approval rate used to be really good in the first 5 years before 2003. But after 2003, so what happened? Around that time, we had SARS. And SARS, the mainland Chinese government and in Kongzhou area, the government or the local official, they tend to hide that information. So Hong Kong suffered because of that. I mean, so this is first critical juncture, I would say. And then Hong Kong's, China's image in Hong Kong is also on the rising track before the Beijing Olympic Games in 2008. But after that, around the Beijing 2008 Olympic Games, we got the Sipan earthquake, as well as other instances, and then Hong Kong people think that Chinese government cannot be trusted. At that time, we donated a lot of money to them, but most of the money are, and so this is another critical juncture in 2008. And then another critical juncture is obviously from 2012 and 2014. In 2012, around that time, we talk about the political reform in Hong Kong. And obviously, mainland China government and Hong Kong people cannot compromise in that arena. And then we have the umbrella movement. And that's what we have.
Well, thanks, Nick. I think it's not, at the time, it's not only the Hong Kong, we can say, old generations gap that, when China become richer, it will become, let's say, more educated, more civilized, and eventually become more democratic. Actually, following academic theory, talking about modernization theory, I think that's a general, let's say, prediction of some kind of phenomenon that when you got some social progress, economic development, people will become more educated. You are going to see the rise of middle class, then you are going to see more rule of law, and eventually that will lead to a democracy. But I think it's a little bit too early to say that didn't happen in China. Probably some people will say not yet. If you compare China in 2017 and compare China in 1997, you'll find China is much more open, much more internationalized. In 1997, very few Chinese students study in this country. But now, in this country, we got 100,000 Chinese students in this country as well. I think you are going to say Chinese teacher like me, like Dr. Yin as well. So I think there is remarkable changes happening in China as well. So probably it's not there yet. Let's wait and see what will happen in 2 or 3 decades later. But I think it's quite nice. You mentioned about the political reform in Hong Kong. I think there's a big debate over whether we need a limited democracy or full democracy. And when you mention about the approval rates, especially about the SARS issue, for example, my question here, very quick question is, do you think that is a problem really mishandled by the Hong Kong executive, let's say, executive government, or it's a problem of Beijing in some cases like SARS?
Well, for SARS, I think both didn't do a good job. Both Hong Kong government and also not necessarily the Beijing government, but the Guangzhou, the local government in Guangzhou area, right? So I think, as I still remember, Beijing was quite proactive. They are willing to help. They try to give us a lot of resources. But I think it's a really first close encounter when the government, the local government in China and the Hong Kong government collaborate to deal with a crisis, and they didn't do well. So I think it's not completely disaster, but I think it's quite a remarkable event that people in Hong Kong still remember. And I would say that event, triggered the 2003 really big, large-scale protest in Hong Kong, which have over 500,000 people. Of course, the protest is about the national security legislation in Hong Kong, which was really, really controversial. But I think the economic backdrops as well as the SARS disaster also cultivate that sentiment at that time.
Yeah, I think SARS is really a very interesting case study because I saw some academic researcher doing research on the crisis management. I think it's not only Hong Kong was ill, but also Beijing has some problems in how to handling the issue. So I think it's a learning curve for mainland China as well in handling all those kind of crisis management. I guess we have to move on a little bit. Let's spend some time talk about, here we're talking about lost and found, right? 2017 is 20 years after Hong Kong come back to China. So Winnie, can you tell me a little bit more about what does the anniversary actually means to people in Hong Kong, or probably people in China, or in other places, maybe in UK? You want to address?
Or Taiwan. Yeah. I think the Taiwan case is actually quite a fascinating one, because the one country, two systems model that is currently in Hong Kong was actually created for Taiwan in China's efforts to unify, to bring Taiwan back into the fold, we shall say. And the thing that's quite fascinating is that, as we would expect in Taiwan, you have a lot of concerns to see how governance of Hong Kong, how the mainland Chinese government maintains the basic law, how the local government in Hong Kong is engaging with, I don't want to say colluding, but engaging with the Beijing government in terms of governance of Hong Kong citizens, its policy in general, even dealing with social political issues and of inequality, for instance. So what we see in Taiwan is really something quite fascinating, where you have the government very, very protective, very, very aware and concerned about the potential implications of the one country, two systems model and what it might mean for Taiwan. And again, the citizens of Taiwan also are very concerned about that. There's a lot of movement within Taiwan about whether or not they should formally push for independence, whether or not you have about the idea of having a growing Taiwanese, independent Taiwanese identity. At the same time, however, because I specialize in state, non-state actor relations, so basically how the state creates policy and how activists and individuals and citizens really influence the state and lobby the state for policy reform, the key thing that we see is that even though there is this legitimate concern about the Beijing government and the one country, two systems might be applied in Taiwan, socioeconomic relations between Taiwan and China are at an unprecedented high. You will not, China is Taiwan's #1 trading partner, it's #1 destination for investment. It's also the second most popular destination for overseas, for international studies, for Taiwanese studies on the mainland. You have marriages between citizens of Taiwan and the mainland China reaching into the 500,000. There's a lot of intensive engagement. So there's a lot of concerns. There's a lot of contradictions and tensions as to how they may feel about the reunification of Hong Kong, but at the same time seeing the reality that, like I said earlier, China is a reality for the region as well as for their survival. So how do you deal with that?
I think this is not only probably a challenge for Hong Kong and Taiwan as well. I think probably for UK a little bit. About China, you can say that's a challenge, how you are going to deal with China's rise, right? You're going to embrace China's rise, or you're going to contain China's rise. I mean, that's part of the thing. Speaking of Taiwan, I think I read a very interesting opinion poll, I think just come out last week or something, talking about more Taiwan people have positive view about China's future than negative views. I think it's quite a critical turning point about Taiwan's opinions, I think. We can leave that to the discussion. But Dr. Yin, can you tell us a bit more about what do you think about the anniversary means, more specifically for China? I mean, we know that President Xi Jinping went to Hong Kong as well, as always, as usual. Every year, go to Hong Kong, go to Macau, big ceremony, bring a few Olympic champions to celebrate about Hong Kong and mainland China. I think when China go to have the space project, they also tend to bring all those kind of stars to Hong Kong, trying to show about soft power of China. So, what do you think?
Right, I tend to pull subjects back to my comfort zone. Right? I think right now, particularly under Xi Jinping's administration, one of the biggest issues with regarding one country and two systems is how do you expect to generate a social recognition, nation building? How do you achieve nation building while this country is practically separated in two? And there is no problem at the time when China and mainland China and Hong Kong are completely belongs to completely two different sovereigns. But now, once you have the rhetoric throwing out that we are one nation, the problem really goes to how do you expect to build the social recognition on the floor from the people. Having two systems is not necessarily good for, not necessarily in the case of Hong Kong or Taiwan or Macau to build a national recognition. However, China's or the Communist Party's conventional political knowledge or political experience calls for one approach, doing business. Don't think that doing business is something that invented by Deng Xiaoping. No, doing business is started in the Long March period, when during the 1931 to 1936. Right, so the whole period when the Communist Party was an underdog and driven away to the hinterland of China. And there, you're bound to a bunch of city kids, right, like a bunch of elites from the city. Many of them actually speak fluent French, right? So and Russian, by the way. How do you expect a bunch of a city kid would really understand what's going on in the most outermost remote area in inland China, and particularly those areas you have Muslims, you have Tibetans, you have all sorts of ethnic minorities. They don't even share the same language. How do you expect to engage with them? Mao said one thing: let's do business, 做生意, right? And doing business is one good thing, right? Practically speaking, you put off all sorts of religious and ideological, which are practically the same, religious belief, prejudice against each other, and then start to really interact. I guess that's the main issue. Once you start to interact and people start to witness the miracle, I tend to use this word, the miracle of the change of your life through this sort of engagement, and then you start to like put their ideological differences at ease. So in the Cold War time, Communist China engaged with the Third World by doing business. Even during the Cultural Revolutionary time, business was as usual. And so Hong Kong, at the moment, the business is not necessarily going well, and the exchange is not necessarily going well. And henceforth, there is a recognition issue.
Yeah, I know, and then that need to our next question about Hong Kong's future. I think we have talked a little bit about one country, two system, right? I mean, now it's 20 years after Hong Kong's unification with China. If you remember, Deng Xiaoping ever said, we will keep one country, two system. We will never change it in 50 years' time. And then we got 30 years left. So do you two want to share a bit with us about what are your view about Hong Kong's future? What do you think about the future of one country, two system?
Thank you. I sure will. So I think that this is the key point in the future. So 2047, when these 50 years run out, that's the clinching point for Hong Kong and its relations. And there are kind of three options at that point in time for what's going to happen to Hong Kong when the 50 years of promised one country, two system runs out. The first option is to extend and continue the role as a special administrative region, extend the basic law, and so on. So continue a one country, two system principle much along the lines of what we're seeing now, perhaps in modified form. The second option is to extend maybe some of those differences, we might call it privileges or accommodations, but not all of them. So some soft, light version, one country and a slightly different system. And the third option is that Hong Kong becomes part of Greater Shenzhen and this becomes a kind of integrated, ordinary Chinese region. And different people in different parts of China, Hong Kong, the rest of the world, have a preference for all three of those options. Now, which one will we end up with in 2047? I'm not going to give you the answer today. But I think much of what ends up being the case at that point will depend not only on Hong Kong government, Hong Kong people, and mainland government, mainland people, but also on the rest of the world and how the rest of the world relate to China, to the PRC. And this is where I'm going to loop back to Trump and take up your invitation to bring him into the conversation. Because if we look at what Xi Jinping is currently doing as a leader, is he's launching China as a new kind of world leader, of a better kind of world order. And this attempt had started a little bit under previous President Hu Jintao. This effort to be the good superpower on the bloc has become remarkably much easier since Trump was inaugurated into the White House. Because suddenly, Xi Jinping can stand at global environmental talks, he can stand at fora around the Belt and Road Initiative, which is his big flagship project that we will all know very much about pretty soon. And he can say, I am the advocate of an open world order. I am the advocate of win-win solutions. And Trump says, you know what? I think that state leaders should only look after their own populations. They should take advantage of other countries if they can. This is not so attractive, right, to other countries around the world who are clearly the ones that are going to be taken advantage of. So, Xi Jinping, I think, in this effort to convince the world and convince his own population that the Communist Party are the leaders of the good guys on the bloc, has to fit Hong Kong into this picture, right? This image management on a global scale. And a big crackdown against an independence movement or a pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong looks bad in the eyes of many people. But when the alternative is Trump, you have to be significantly less worried about how that looks, right? Because the alternative looks pretty bad and pretty crackdowny. So I think the extent to which the world reacts to Beijing-Hong Kong relations will be massively important, and the way this plays out on Twitters and on media channels, on CNN and BBC and so on, will be really, really significant, and we will all play a part in shaping how any confrontation goes down between Beijing and Hong Kong, and how Beijing can react to claims for special treatment or even separatism in Hong Kong.
Really quick way then. Quick answer is I can't predict. Social scientists are not good at prediction, right? I mean, just like the election we did, right? We in recent years we can't really predict well, but it doesn't mean that we can't say anything about it. We still got some knowledge about it. I mean, from Hong Kong's community in the society, I mean, basically there are three discourses about Hong Kong's future. So one discourse is about integration with mainland China. This group of people, who would normally support this kind of, they are normally pro-government people. They are the elite class. They have a really good business relationship. I mean, some of them have really good business relationship with mainland China. So it's like what Astrid just mentioned. The other camp is about maintain the status quo, maintain the SAR, Special Administrative Region arrangement. So maintain one country, two system. But I'm personally, and I'm not very optimistic about this arrangement, because, say, for example, one country, two system is open to interpretation by the Beijing government somehow. And another option, which is less likely but is still popular, particularly among young people, is to go for independence. Say as far as I understand from some of the people in Hong Kong, we try to draw lessons from, say, Catalonia, from some other independence movement. in terms of the capacity, of course, Hong Kong, we don't have military power. We have a lot of economic reliance on mainland China. Is not really likely, but it's ongoing. People are discussing about it, and they may organize something to make it realized. I'm not very optimistic, but it could happen.
Great. Thanks very much. I mean, I'm sorry that we don't have enough time. Otherwise, I would like to invite Winnie and Dr. Yin to give us a little bit discussion. Yeah.
Just one thing to tack on to Nick is the PLA is located on Hong Kong. So if there's going to be an independence movement, that's going to happen. It's just this huge building waiting, yeah. So when Xi Jinping came to Hong Kong and there was that big military parade, it was was very clear to remind the people of Hong Kong who's in charge. Yeah.
Well, I think it's quite important here to probably bring in about the PLA in Macau. If you guys are following about the hurricane, I think a rainstorm in Macau happened, and the PLA actually was asked by the Macau government come out to solve some kind of problems the Macau people really cannot do by themselves. That will be very, I mean, I'm not sure whether that will happen in Hong Kong or not, but that's kind of a role the PLA is playing in Macau at the moment. So now I would like to open the floor for Q&A. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask any question to any speaker if you like. Maybe the gentleman here. Yeah, you can start first, and then.
I just wanted, it was an open question to the panel. I guess what the media landscape and how that's changed over the 20 years in terms of, any media outlets that still have sort of anti-mainland China sentiments, or whether they've been drowned out, or things along those lines. How's that been maintained?
Okay, thank you. I think we are going to collect 3 questions in a row.
Right. 20 years ago, it might have been the jewel in the crown. And at that time, Hong Kong's economy made up of 17% of China's GDP. 20 years on, now it's 3%. So I wonder whether the jewel has become a thorn on the side of President Xi. But more specifically, two months ago, the Hong Kong Trade Development Council, the KTDC, threw a big party. Well, what I mean is a conference. It's called Think Asia, Think Hong Kong. The tagline has changed. It's no longer a gateway into mainland China. So the whole thing was banging on about the one belt, one road. So my specific question is, with the New World Order, President Xi is carefully mapping out, connecting mainland China through Turkey to Europe, which stopped in Belgium and France, by the way. Of course, Brexit Britain will not be part of that one belt, one road. How do you see Hong Kong's geopolitical stance play out? Or whether it would become really increasingly irrelevant?
Yeah. Thank you. We can have the third one, please.
Thank you. I have a question regarding Taiwan and how Taiwan can view Hong Kong's position and this question is directed to Dr. Winnie, yourself. So I understand that China proposed a one-party, two-system to Taiwan initially. As you mentioned, it's actually used for Hong Kong's model now. How can Taiwan fit into this idea of reunification in the future? With this whole dependency, economic dependency from Taiwan and Hong Kong on China, would that be a huge factor, or would that be a fighting force for these autonomous regions?
Yeah. Winnie, why don't you start by responding to this question first, and then I will just give it to Nick to address the question about anti-mainland China sentiment. Is it okay? Yeah.
Okay, so on the issue of Taiwan, how basically does it view Hong Kong and the situation of the one country, two systems with regards to its own future? Where does it fit, I guess, is the main point. It doesn't. And what I mean by that is Taiwan's in a position where not just because of its close socioeconomic ties with Hong Kong, with China, with mainland China, it's not in a position to defend itself from it. The way it would defend itself is if the Americans will come in. It will not be happening under Trump. Trump's preoccupied with so many other things. LeVar Ball, so on. But I mean, I'm taking a very realist stance here because I think we need to be realistic about it. Is the Taiwan right now, for instance, has an independence-oriented president. She is not popular, and she's not popular because Taiwan's economy is not doing well. She's not popular because there's a lot of concerns about how Taiwan will survive when she has a very negative and not amenable approach towards engaging with China. Which means, I mean, I'm not going to predict what the next election will be, but there's a lot of concerns with that. And in Taiwan, and in most Asian economies, money talks. You can't. Having a vote doesn't mean much if you can't feed your family. So in the case of one country, two systems, reunification will happen. It just depends on when, and it depends on under what conditions, whether it will be war or whether it will be a soft coup. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think it's media landscape, right? Yeah. I mean, in media landscape, from what I found from the research, is that soon after Hanover or right before Hanover, journalists start to feel worried about how do they report about China, and it induced kind of self-censorship among themselves. But of course, I mean, journalists, by and large, they still got their autonomy to decide what to report. But from a number of surveys, self-censorship, I mean, there's a shadow of mainland Chinese influence. But I mean, in recent years, I mean, as you may read from the news, the missing bookseller is a really remarkable event, right? So people, I mean, not just about that event, and also the former managing editor of Minbao was attacked on the street. We, of course, obviously, we won't be able to find out who initiated the attack, but I mean, a lot of media, they are, I mean, getting worried about what they do and how they will be treated at the end. But the good thing about now we are at the internet age, and then we have a lot of internet media outlets, and some of them are independent. Some of them, they rely on crowdsourcing to get the funding and try to get away from the business people. By and large, we are still really vibrant, really diverse, and some of them are really autonomous as well.
Okay, so the second question about what will be Hong Kong's geopolitical, let's say, role in the new world order. I think you are quite right to say that, I mean, 20 years ago, Hong Kong is 17%, now 3%. I think there is a lot of anxiety in Hong Kong as well about the competition from China, especially from Shenzhen and Shanghai. But I think the same is here, is you still need to remember, although, I mean, China is on rise, but it's quite different from Hong Kong. Hong Kong has a lot of advantage, I mean, in terms of rule of law, in terms of English, and also talents, the Hong Kong students, and also in terms of its I mean, internationalization. In all those different areas, Hong Kong still have its advantage. I think, which compare with Shenzhen and Shanghai, I think it's much more internationalized, you would say. I think, yes, last week I was following about the Victoria's Secret show in Shanghai, and they suddenly got some problems with the models cannot go to Shanghai because of visa. I think this is a part that Hong Kong definitely have more advantage over, given its internationalization, this kind of things. But if the question here you're asking is what Hong Kong should do to make it more relevant, I think it's a question probably for all the countries in the world. What shall we do in the era of China's rise, right? I think the UK is also talking about that. Shall we, let's say, engage China, embrace China's rise, or shall we contain it? I don't think contain mainland China is an option for Hong Kong. So there is no option for Hong Kong. You should really embrace rise of China, make the most of it, use your own advantage. That's the only thing Hong Kong can do to make it more relevant in the wider context of China's rise. Yeah, maybe Dr. Yin can add something on that.
Well, I mean, it's not just Hong Kong. Everywhere, every province in China was trying to figure out a way how to engage with one road, one belt thing. So Doing while exploring while doing is, I guess, is the mentality. And the second thing, I think, is just follow up Astrid said. Western media concentrate on Xi Jinping's talk about globalization, global order in Davos. But however, in 2015, Xi Jinping made a talk, the first ever anniversary talk on Bandung Conference, the 60 years of anniversary of Bandung, addressing to the third world nations, talking about a different type of world order, and that hasn't been covered. I guess when we talk about the global vision, a global order for China under the Xi Jinping administration, we might have to think about what sort of what does he mean by global order? What sort of internationalism? What sort of a globalization he was referring to by looking at all the talks and not just the talks in the West happening in Europe?
I just want to add to what he said is with regards to what you were talking about in terms of what Hong Kong can do. One thing we need to remember is that the Belt and Road Initiative, that is Xi Jinping's main project for the next 5 years at least. Hong Kong's not part of it, so that's very significant. If Hong Kong is going to secure its position, it needs to diversify its economy, and it cannot diversify away from the services because industry is not going to. Producing is not going to mean much in terms of manufacturing. It needs to diversify with regards to securing its position in the renminbi internationalization, becoming absolutely important and at the center of it, as the Chinese government has attempted to make it in the first place. And once it embraces that and makes it the central pillar, I would say, the BRI must then eventually come through Hong Kong at some point, and then it keeps it within the loop. That's what I mean.
Great. I think because of time, we only have last round of questions. If anyone, I think we got a few questions in the end. The lady, yeah.
Hi. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. I have a question for Dr. Zhang, the host. I think we met once back in the LSE One World, One World initiative 2 weeks ago. The question is, do you actually see that China actually violate the Sino-British Joint Declaration signed in 1980 between Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping is actually a contributing factor for the Umbrella Revolution in 2014 and all the actually social, I wouldn't say discontent, but it's like a negative feelings towards China, which then actually led to pro-democracy, pro-independence group in Hong Kong. What do you see to that?
Can you rephrase your question again?
Okay. The question is, do you see that actually China, PRC, actually violate the Sino-British Declaration signed between Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping, which actually promised the one country, two system, a high degree of autonomy in Hong Kong, and is actually a contributing factor for the occurrence of the Umbrella Revolution in 2014.
Okay, thank you. We can have another 2 questions before we finish the.
Well, kind of a similar question is whether do you think China is honoring one country, two systems and the basic law? And if we see that there's an erosion of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and all the freedoms in Hong Kong, what does it mean to how Hong Kong people can trust the Beijing government, and what does it show in the world? Does it mean that is China going stronger economically? It can do whatever it's like to do.
And last one.
Okay, so just, I guess, sort of jumping off from that, talking about erosion of free speech and everything like that, I'm going to be a stereotypical millennial here and ask what you all think the relationship of free speech, social media especially, and sort of the Great Firewall of China is going to be in the future of Hong Kong in the next several years. And you also talked a lot about Taiwan and how what the future of that territory could potentially look like. How do you all think that the integration, perhaps, of less freedom of speech or erosion of freedom of speech, in addition to the Great Firewall, in addition to social media and the growth of sort of unrest movements on social media, is going to play into that future?
And you have a question?
Actually, I wanted to ask about the judiciary in Hong Kong and the rule of law, and whether you felt that there might be some undermining of that. especially as the judiciary becomes localized and the mainland China has an influence on the judges that perhaps come into play. And given that that's such an important part of Hong Kong's economic strength and the way the international community view Hong Kong, do you feel that that might be something that's impacting on how people regard Hong Kong and investment in Hong Kong today?
Okay, thank you. I think what we can do is each one of us spend maybe 30 seconds, very quickly response, trying to wrap up our discussion and everything. I think I will start. I think pretty much some of the questions here are very relevant. I think for the first question, I think probably it's the way I think China trying to handle it with Hong Kong, they also have a learning process as well. I mean, each time a new administration coming, they got a new person coming, they need to learn a little bit more about how to handling about this kind of issues. I mean, Nick mentioned about the bookseller and different kind of things. I think to some extent you can say that that's probably just a learning cost or starting cost. They didn't really handle it very well. And in terms of the question, second, third, asking about freedom of speech, judicial independence, I think those kind of issues are precisely Hong Kong's advantage. This is why, back to the question I'm saying, I think that's kind of advantage Hong Kong really should use to make it more relevant in the future world order. This is a part that Hong Kong cannot be replaced by any Chinese city like Shenzhen and Shanghai, because they all have kind of problems that and cannot be dealt with. So I will pass mine to.
Okay. I can't remember what the second question was, but I remember the judiciary one. Your question about whether or not the judiciary is being affected. Yes, it is. Absolutely. But the thing that you need to remember is that when it comes to Hong Kong and when it comes to how China views Hong Kong, economics is, I don't want to use the word sacrosanct, but it's quite protected. So when it comes to how the judiciary is being affected, it has to do with issues of the protesters. It has to do with how Joshua Wong how he was treated and his fellow student leaders. When it comes to contract law, when it comes to intellectual property, when it comes to that, we're good to go. Like the value of the reputation of Hong Kong's rule of law and the civil service as another point. Are invaluable for China, for its economy. And so if it is touched, they probably don't realize they're doing it and will probably pull back when they realize that they do.
Okay, quickly then, has this undermined the trust of the Hong Kong people? Yeah, so what? We're talking about an authoritarian government. So we need to ask ourselves, in what ways might it matter if trust is undermined, if we have a government that can enforce what it likes regardless? Social media, Great Firewall, lack of freedom of speech, and how this will affect the future of Hong Kong. So I've written quite a lot about social media in China and the Great Firewall and the creative ways that people get around it, which is great fun. And I used to be really outraged that you couldn't tweet in China. Until someone asked me, Astrid, will the revolution be tweeted? Like, what social change is going to come from Twitter? When people go online, they watch porn and cute kittens. Like, this is not what's going to get social change to happen. This is the new opium of the people. I haven't decided whether they're right yet. Yeah, that's what we got on Twitter, Trump, right? Yeah. So I'm maybe listen to Winnie. Maybe social media will be the vehicle for social change in Hong Kong. But let us at least ask ourselves questions about the power of the freedoms that a lot of us have and use for crap.
I think on internet we are still quite separate from mainland China, so we do, by and large, we still have the freedom. And like mainland China, say when people talk about Winnie the Pooh, because he looks like presidency and there is censor, it's never happened in Hong Kong at this moment. But in the future, say for example, the former chief executive of Hong Kong, CY Leung, he is a really big fan of the Singapore model. So as you may know, Singapore is a really successful authoritarian regime. They are really skillful in monitoring the domestic internet discussion. And I think it really depends on how the local official, say chief executive of Hong Kong, would operate in the future. Carrie Lam looks a little bit, at least from what she expressed, is quite different from CY Leung. But I think the Singapore model is still in the mind of a lot of elites or officials in Hong Kong. So it could be the future, but that's
Yeah, great. So we have summarized basically about Hong Kong's future. I think really for Hong Kong, China's rise is something it has to deal with. So there is no second way. Hong Kong really have to embrace China's rise and to say how to make it relevant. But for Beijing as well, really have to make Hong Kong people really like China. There is no other choice as well. This is about soft power of one country, two system. It's about China's rise as well. So I think we really, probably people in Beijing and people in Hong Kong really need to make this relationship works. I understand that we probably have more questions, but sorry that we don't have enough time. I'm a little bit worried that we are 15 minutes over. But some of the speakers need to run to the station very quickly. But some of the speakers will stay. So if you would like to speak with us after the event, please welcome to do so. And thanks very much for coming as well. And also thanks for Louise. And do you want to say anything? Yeah.
I just want to say if everyone could join me in thanking our speakers this evening. It's been a really informative event.